said. Mr. M. Kelly Tillery, son of Allen Tillery, who served in the Pacific Theater as a Japanese interpreter for the United States Marine Corps in the 22nd Marine Regiment, 6th Marine Division. Corporal Allen J. Jere is his name, Jere Tillery, was born in January 1925 in Shreveport, Louisiana, and was in high school when the surprise bombing of Pearl Harbor took place, and the United States formally entered World War II. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1943 and was sent to Japanese language school at Camp Elliott. Upon completion of the Japanese language school, Mr. Tillery participated in the amphibious landings in the Pacific Theater and saw combat in the Marshall and Mariana Islands. He is the author of Well and Smartly Done, A Remembrance of War, 1943 to 1945, which is, in the words of his son, Kelly, recounts the unique experiences of being taught to kill his enemy, but also to speak and understand the language. This is what he sent me, and when I sent a note back and asked, is this how you want it to be done? And he sent me an incredible response. I don't know if you know how much of an impact this made, but as a late 60s, how's that, type person. He wrote back and he said, M. Kelly Tillery was born 9 years to the day after Corporal Tillery was discharged from the Marine Corps. Like most young boys of that era, Kelly grew up watching Vic Morrow in Combat and Robert Lansing in 12 O'Clock High on TV, and asking his father, "What did you do in the war, Daddy?" Corporal Tillery's book is the answer to that common question. I thank you for that response. I'm going to plagiarize that many, many times. With that said, please.
I'm particularly honored to be here to be the inaugural speaker in this august group's new series, From and For a New Generation. I note that the last speaker, who was a veteran, was 105 years old. I'm about 38 years younger, so hopefully I'll have the stamina to finish this in an hour. It's a tough act to follow. The historian Jonathan Darman said, "It is the privilege of the old soldier to speak realistically of war and idealistically of peace, and also speaking for those who do not live to speak for themselves." I speak today for my father and for those of his generation. However, as a lawyer and historian, I have to ask respectfully that the series name, I Speak for My Father, be amended somewhat to perhaps, and sometimes, my mother. As many of you know, 350,000 women served in uniform for the United States troops during the Second World War. 16 were killed in action by enemy fire. Let us not forget the other millions, of course, on the home front, from Rosie the Riveter to Harriet the Homemaker, all supporting the noble cause, perhaps the last just war in our lifetime. As Abigail Adams advised her husband John on March 31, 1776, "I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." Well, John did not, but we should. My father often said he served so that my brothers and I would not have to. I did not serve, or at least I served my nation in civilian capacity. I worked for the President's National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse in 1972. Before you go crazy, I was not a tester. I also served in the Army Claims Service briefly, in a very exciting job handling claims. I never really served in combat, I never served in uniform, and I certainly never served at what my father refers to as the point, which I will explain. But perhaps I can speak for my father, who was there. He often told us that he fought so that we would not have to, and he succeeded in that regard. Though my brothers and I were subject to the draft during the Vietnam War, we both had high numbers and were never called. And I'm glad of that for a number of reasons, because my mother swears she would have taken us to Canada, and I hate cold weather, can't eat back bacon, and don't like Molson. My father, who was a good Marine and a good patriotic soldier, told my mother that if his sons were called, as much as he disliked and disagreed with the Vietnam War, he said we would have to go. Because if your nation calls, you go. My mother and father both said that they would have been divorced had that happened, because my mother would have taken us to Canada. Fortunately, that never happened. His sacrifice and that of millions of others did defeat tyrants and preserve democracy in a large part of the world for a long time, and created a world of plenty and peace, yet at enormous cost of blood and treasure. While he detested the colossal stupidity and waste of war, he was all too cognizant of the fact that there are evil, powerful, corrupt, greedy, and fanatical people in the world who will seek to destroy democracy and freedom and take what is not theirs. And they must be stopped. And we must be prepared and willing to stop them. There is always a rising tide of tyranny in history from the outside and oftentimes from the inside. I am in this completely confident that I speak for my father when I say, never stop fighting for democracy and freedom. You may not know this, but there are only 88 democracies in the world today. There are 92 autocracies. Only about 7% of the planet live under free liberal democracy. 74% live under autocracies. We should be grateful for what we have. My wife Jennifer, who sits there, Jennifer Hassel, and I visited Japan recently, where I was able to use a few phrases that my father had taught me, although in a Japanese restaurant you don't want to ask how many machine gun nests are in them. But he did teach me a few good words. We were struck by many things in Japan, but two stand out. First, the Japanese people are the kindest, most gentle, respectful, peaceful folks you would ever want to meet. It is almost impossible to imagine that such a people were responsible for the rape of Nanking, Pearl Harbor, the Bataan Death March, the Korean Comfort Women, Unit 731, and 1,000 other atrocities in the World War. Second, there is an eerie and curious silence in their culture about the century between 1853 and 1945. That period of Japanese industrialization, militarization, expansion, colonialism, invasions, and multiple wars of choice. It is as if there's a collective social memory that's been erased, with one exception, the dropping of the atomic bomb. They don't forget that. Both phenomena are quite different than what experiences in Germany, if you've been there. It is with no little irony that the United States, and indeed United States Marines, were there at the beginning and at the end of that 92-year period, and were actually instrumental in starting and ending it. On July 8, 1853, Admiral Perry and his black ships sailed into what was then called Edo Harbor, now Tokyo Harbor, and at gunpoint opened up the feudal nation of Japan to the rest of the world. Within a couple of generations, Japan had defeated China, then Russia, and by 1931 begun its territorial expansion and wars, which ended in humiliation and defeat and surrender on the USS Missouri, September 2nd, 1945. As on Admiral Perry's flagship, the USS Susquehanna, Admiral Chester Nimitz had a contingent of United States Marines on his battleship on that surrender day. Semper Fi, indeed. This is a story of one man. Any slice of a life story, particularly of a soldier's story, must be viewed and understood in the context of the time, the place, and of course of history. My father often said in answer to my interminable context questions about the war, that a soldier, particularly a Marine serving at the point, sees, hears, feels, smells, and cares about only what is right in front of him, right in the immediate area. At that moment, he is not in context. At that moment, he is in the moment. It is a moment to survive only. My father was only one of 127 million human beings who served and fought in that war. But each moment on each bloody beach and stinking jungle was then just his. It is for us now, long after the fog of war has cleared, to pull back our viewfinder, to look at his effort in the context of his time, his world, and our history, and if we can, to learn from it. This is the story of one man, but also the story of every man, or at least every soldier, especially those who served in combat at the point. I like to look at numbers as a historian, and some of the numbers about World War II are telling. 16 million people served in uniform on behalf of the United States. It was 11% of the population. Today that would be 36 million Americans serving. 61% were drafted, about 60% served in combat. Probably less than 500,000 actually served at the point. Again, I'll explain that in a minute. Almost 1,900,000 were African American. 33,000 were Japanese Americans. Although at the same time, 120,000 of their relatives were interred in 10 internment camps. Internment camps. We suffered 407,316 deaths and 670,846 wounded. Everyone who served had a story. Only some get told. Very few, actually. Today we have about 65,000 veterans that live. About 15,000 receive some kind of benefits from the government. We're losing any number every day and every year. In a few years there will be none. That will be very sad. Thus, my presence to speak for those who no longer can. And at some point, there will be one last veteran of World War II, as there was in the Civil War. I always got a kick out of Pleasant Riggs Kump. He died at 104 in 1951. He was the last living soldier from the Civil War, 76 years after Appomattox, where he was. Ironically, he died in Lincoln, Alabama. He was a Confederate soldier. We are today 81 years from that surrender in Tokyo Bay. Humans have been writing history about war for a long time. The first accounts of actual soldiers' lives were by Thucydides, who was a general, in 464 BC, an Athenian general. We get our stories from letters home from soldiers, from diaries, from memoirs, and some from official reports. The letters home, since they're contemporaneous, are usually the best. I'm sorry to say my father kept his letters home to his mother and his family in a sealed file and never showed them to anyone. Sadly, they were inundated in Hurricane Betsy. I never got to read them, but he did write a book, which we have here, and I'll tell you about it. In 1965, he wrote this book, or at least he finished the book. He started writing it after the war. But 20 years after the events, he says he was inspired to write it because he read a book about his grandfather's service in the Civil War. That book is 1491 Days in the Confederate Army by William Hartzell. And it's the story of the W.P. Lane Rangers in the Civil War, Confederate unit, and his grandfather served in that. So he read that in high school, he got inspired, and after he hand-printed this book and sent it to me. He didn't send it to me in '65 because I was only 11 years old. I don't know why. He didn't send it until 1985. In 1985, he sent a copy to myself and my brothers. He said, "For Kelly, a codification of all the war stories and sea tales that you will never have to listen to again." September 10th, 1985. I sure wish I could listen to them again, but I do have them recorded anyway. I'd like to give you some context of his life. He was born in 1925. What was the world like in 1925? We weren't there. We don't really know. But I can tell you it was a simpler place. It was a quieter time. There were only 48 states. Calvin Coolidge, old silent cow, was the president. Stock market crash was a few years off. Things were booming. The world was oddly and thankfully at peace. Hitler was still an obscure rabble-rouser, though he had just published a volume of Mein Kampf. Mussolini was just establishing his fascist dictatorship. Franklin Roosevelt was dealing with polio in obscurity. Churchill toiled in political obscurity as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Radio was popular, there was certainly no TV, and talkies were just coming out. There were 115 million people in the country. The biggest dispute was evolution. John T. Scopes was on trial in Tennessee for teaching evolution, which was contrary to what the Bible taught. Curiously, my father, when he was an editor of his high school newspaper in 1940, interviewed John Scopes, who was then a petroleum engineer in Shreveport, and wrote a nice article about him. Jim Crow thrived in the United States. The KKK had over 5 million members, the largest fraternal organization in the country. It put on a 40,000-man march in Washington, D.C. on the anniversary, the 60th anniversary of the passage of the 13th Amendment ending slavery. Many former slaves and slave owners were still alive. In 1936, my father was 11 years old. He rode in a parade at one of the last group meetings of Confederate veterans in 1936 in Shreveport, Pennsylvania, with his great uncle, whose name was Goodwin Lafayette Tillery, affectionately known as Old Coot. He and Old Coot were in a sedan, and he said he could recall former slaves on the side of the road watching those Confederate veterans go by. We're not that far away from that era. In addition to Allen J, a number of famous and memorable people were born that year. Paul Newman and Rod Steiger, Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis, Charlie Chaplin and Peter Sellers, Robert Kennedy and Margaret Thatcher. Fast forward to 1943. Allen J was 17 or 18. He was at Fair Park High School in Shreveport, Pennsylvania. He was a lieutenant colonel.
Louisiana, right?
Louisiana, yes.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania.
Louisiana. The invasion of Europe was still a year off. Allied victories had been accomplished in North Africa and the East. The U-boats had been chased out of the Atlantic. Italy had caved in, but there were still big challenges in the Pacific. Japan wasn't going anywhere. I ran across the 1941 yearbook of my father, Shreveport, Louisiana, which was done before Pearl Harbor, and it's very optimistic. The book is filled with quotes from the Constitution, references to free elections and gratitude for the freedom and abundance provided by our democracy in a time of war elsewhere designed to destroy such freedoms. These students appreciated their freedoms, and yet there was also an enormous service in the ROTC. I looked upon it as the last moments of innocence before the war. And of course, then came Pearl Harbor. At the time, the draft age was 21. And therefore, the students in high school, these students, their last innocence, they didn't think they would ever serve in the military or go to war. They were soon to be proven wrong. In 1942, the law changed, and the draft age was lowered to 17. My father had an older brother who was in Carlson's Raiders, who had been at Macon Atoll at Guadalcanal, and served with President Roosevelt's son, who was part of that team. So my father wanted to become a Marine, so he enlisted in the Marine Corps. And he did very well, apparently, in tests, in boot camp, and was told, son, you're going to Japanese language school. And he kind of fell down and said, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. I don't know anything about Japanese. And they said, well, you're going to learn. At the time, the Army had only a handful of people who could speak and read Japanese. The Navy had less, and the Marines had just a handful. Learning to speak Japanese was a chore. After boot camp, which was 9 weeks, after learning for 9 weeks how to kill his enemy, he was then taught how to speak to his enemy and to read his enemy's papers. That took 12 weeks. He always thought that was curious, that it took longer to learn how to understand your enemy than to kill him. I also ran across a 1942 yearbook from Fair Park, which is a little different. It's the last yearbook that was published until 1946. It was was the first yearbook after Pearl Harbor and America's entry into the war. Curiously, the 1941 book and this book don't mention war at all, specifically. However, there is an immemorial picture of the first student killed. I'm not sure if he's killed in the war or not because he's not in a service uniform. But my father was a lieutenant colonel in the ROTC. And there's a quote in here about the ROTC. It says, as a result of ROTC training, many cadets will receive commission in the armed services. These cadets will become the future commanding officers of the United States Army, since the Army looks constantly towards ROTC units to fill its ever-expanding ranks. We were at a point where people were expecting they would be in the service. My father was the editor-in-chief of the school newspaper. He was the lieutenant colonel of the ROTC. He was a big man on campus. He tried to get into West Point, but he lived on the other side of the tracks and had no political connections, and therefore never got that. He had his life, which turned out a little different. There is a quote of him, however, as editor for the paper, which I think is telling. I'd like to read to you. He said, this year the powwow staff, powwow is the name of the paper, faces the most difficult task in its history. To help the school do its part in national defense is our definite aim. In fact, the nation's victory will depend greatly upon the public spirit and cooperation fostered by journalism. And journalism is fighting for its very lifeblood, freedom of the press. Less than a year later, he would be a United States Marine, trained to kill those who sought to destroy that freedom. It's a long way from Shreveport, Louisiana, to the bloody beaches of Engevy and Weetock, Harry Island, Tinian, and Guam, where he went. As Lou said, I used to ask my father, as kids at that time did, what did you do in the war, Daddy? And usually it was because we wanted to hear a story, but we also didn't want to go to sleep, so it was an excuse to get him to talk. And usually it worked. He told us a lot of those stories, and I'll try to share some with you. There's some I can't share for a variety of reasons. Attorney-client privilege, not appropriate for his company. As you may know, every Marine is a rifleman. Whether you speak Japanese or German, you are a rifleman. You fight, you go into combat, you face the enemy. You don't sit at a desk. Marines are trained to do that, and he did. The point, which I mentioned before, is something my father always took pride in saying that he had served at the point. Let me read to you what he says about the point. The point of a combat patrol is that Marine moving in advance of the main body of troops. His function is to make first contact with the enemy, to fire or be fired upon, to prevent surprise to the main body. A Marine assigned to the point was assured of a close look at war. Nothing stood between him and the Empire of Japan, nothing but the battle-hardened, fanatical Japanese Imperial Army. The point meant being close enough to see an enemy soldier, hear a rifle fired purposefully, feel machine gun bullets rip the foliage over the foxhole, or see the dead while they were still warm and the blood yet red. The brotherhood of those who served at the point was few in number. War at the point was personal. As with Cain and Abel, it was man killing man. In many ways, it was yet as it had been at Thermopylae, at Crécy, at Waterloo, at Verdun. Our weapons were more efficient, our transport more expedient. The emotion, the loneliness, the fear, sometimes the elation were the same. To close with the enemy, to force your will upon him, to kill him with our rifle and leave him unburied on the field, to see him fall, to touch him, to smell him as he rots in the tropical sun. To wake any morning, thankful to have survived the night, and to realize that you have done those things. Participated in this Armageddon with no feeling or anything, but relief to be alive, no remorse, no regrets, no doubts as to right or wrong. To have violated all the ancient laws of man, so carefully conceived and so artfully promulgated, thou shalt not kill. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Vengeance was at the point. Killing was at the point. War was at the point. My father's service was unique in a number of ways. First is, he saw three distinct views of the war. The first, actually in battle. He hit the beaches of at least a half a dozen of stinking, bloody islands in the South Pacific. out of Higgins boats, which I'll tell you about in a minute. He did it in the jungles, in the mountains, face to face with the enemy. He did it in the hills, in the caves. On many of these islands, what happened was we would bomb the heck out of the Japanese with battleships and planes, and they would hide in caves. And so when the Marines actually got to shore, they'd find that the bombing didn't do a heck of a lot of good, because there were still thousands of Japanese soldiers in the caves, so they had to be rooted out. And third, he saw them in POW camps after they had been defeated and surrendered or captured. So he had those three different viewpoints of his enemies. The other way that his viewpoint was different or unique was, as we said from the beginning, he saw enemy as his enemy. He was kill or be killed, and he had to do it. He was trained to do it, and he did it. But he also was trained to talk to the enemy. He actually talked to them as human beings, understood them, and got to know many of them. He read their papers, he read their letters home, he saw their pictures of their mothers and their girlfriends, and he learned a lot from that. Let me give you a quote from him talking about his transition from the first stage of killing to having some understanding of his enemy. When I left Tinian, a Japanese soldier didn't mean a damn thing to me, just a corpse. And all of a sudden, here I am with 200 or 300 Japanese. He was in a POW camp at that point, interrogating the prisoners. Clean with haircuts. And our job was to interview these guys. I got to know a lot of them. I spent a lot of time with them. They were different kinds of people to me. I spent hours sitting in the hospital talking to the Japs. I got to know them as individuals. They were young men just like I was. Most of them were farmers with very little education. They wanted to know about me, and I wanted to know about them. One thing I remember, they never talked about the future. They never talked about going home. If it had been me, I would have been all I talked about. The emperor wanted them to die. They would be outcasts. As you probably know, Japanese were taught not to surrender. They were taught that the Marines would treat them horribly. Very few of them actually surrendered. And in comparison, it's estimated that only about 19,000 to 50,000 Japanese surrendered or were captured in the war. Japan says it was 42,543, which by doing the numbers, that's 0.07% were captured or surrendered. The corresponding number for American troops is 10 times that. It's not that we were less soldiers or less dedicated, but we had been taught to surrender when it was appropriate and necessary. They were taught they could not surrender. They must die. In fact, they many times killed themselves. My father saw war in its most horrible aspects, although I guess one might argue that the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima might be worse. He said, the early part of the war, I spent my time killing the Japanese, hating Japanese, if you will. I never knew one as an individual. War is a dehumanizing thing. You can't imagine an 18 or 19-year-old boy who's accustomed to going to school at LSU and going to church on Sunday, but war in a short time simply destroys all of that. Part of my job on Tinian was to approve or disapprove of things men want to send back to their families. You would be surprised that one of the main things they sent back was Japanese teeth. The damn things I had to see one day. A man comes in an ashtray that he had made sitting in the middle of the wound was a Japanese skull. And he carved, remember Pearl Harbor in it. It was horrible. We would kill a Japanese soldier and leave him. 2 or 3 days later, we'd come back and he'd be bloated up like a balloon. I often wondered if I was in Germany and killed a German soldier, would I leave him like that? He looks like me. Would I just let him to rot? It's a dehumanizing thing. In his first experience in battle, within 1 week, he landed on 3 beaches, Parry Island and Yebi Island and Anahuitak Island in 1 week. Those were islands probably marshaling 10 to 15,000 Japanese soldiers. Not one Japanese soldier was captured or survived. They were all killed or killed themselves. Not one survived. Corporal Tillery never interrogated any Japanese soldier on those islands in his first landings. It was his skills in fighting, not his skills in speaking, which did him well there. However, at some point, he was delighted because he was called by a lieutenant to interview some some people who were in a shell hole on the beach. And he comes to the beach and there are 4 men naked, Asian men naked in a hole on the beach, a shell hole. And he begins to speak to them in Japanese. And they look at him with deadpan. He tries again, same thing, no reaction at all. And he feels awful. He thought, oh my goodness, I can't speak the language. This is ridiculous. I'm embarrassed. The lieutenant's going to yell at me. And at some point, one of the soldiers realizes that he's speaking Japanese and identifies himself as Korean. They were Korean laborers, they were not Japanese. So he felt a little better about that. I often ask my father, I ask him a lot of questions, but one of them, I said, why did you fight? How the hell could you get off of a Higgins boat and run up a beach where people are shooting at you with machine guns and throwing grenades at you? Who would do such a thing? Why didn't you just turn around and say, no, I'm not doing that, and go back to the boat? I said, well, he said, everyone went. No one remained at home unless too old, disabled, or needed in the home front war effort. Every family felt the pain. No one was spared. 6 months after I joined the Corps, I had friends stationed all over the world. Burma, Australia, Hawaii, the South Pacific, England, North Africa, the Middle East, China, and ships at sea. We covered the globe. This was every man's war. We were called, and we went. Did we know why we went? Yes. Pearl Harbor, the threat of world domination by Hitler, the Battle of Britain, and a president who was very good at telling the American people about the reasons for our sacrifice. Did we know about war? I doubt it. We were young, we were innocent. Only later in college, and after I read some books, did I learn that many people in the government knew that war with Japan was almost inevitable. Why did we fight? By fight, I mean just that, fight. We knew why we enlisted. We knew why we were drafted. We knew why we were proud to be Marines and felt that way. And when we paraded on the parade ground in San Diego or Paris Island, we were proud to wear that green uniform and serve our country. But serving and fighting are different. Killing is not a natural human function. Why did we fight? Fighting and killing is not in our nature. We're not predators. Such conduct is an aberration. My father would say that there were 2 things that he feared most. He feared being a coward. He feared the first time he hit that beach that he would freeze and that he would be embarrassed and he wouldn't support his pals. And he said that's what drove him on, that he was there with his buddies, the people he had trained with and knew, and that's why he continued to go. So he said, and I said, well, what was your other fear? He said, being shot in the groin. He said, every soldier thinks that that's a #1 concern. So I also asked him, why did the Japanese soldiers fight? Why did these guys who later on you see, they're farmers and shopkeepers, they're not much different than you, why did they fight? They were taught to serve the emperor. It was bordered on cultish religious fanaticism. Every soldier in the Imperial Army carried a little black book called the Imperial Mandates and Rescripts, the code of the Japanese soldier. My dad had one of these in his souvenir box, and it contained key phrases which guided him. Death is lighter than a feather, but only duty has the weight of mountains. Kind of says it all. A couple years ago, my wife Jennifer introduced me to her college friend Louis Ashmead Robinson. Her father, John Ashmead, a longtime professor at Haverford College, had also been a Japanese interpreter in the Pacific, and his novel about his experience is called The Mountain and the Feather. When my father had the opportunity to meet the average Japanese soldier through examination of their personal papers and speaking with them in camps, he was surprised to discover how much like him and his pals they were. Yes, in battle they were very fierce. And so were the United States Marines. If you read similar letters and stories of Japanese soldiers, they were terrified of the United States Marines. They didn't mind the Army so much, frankly, or even Navy shelling. They were terrified of the United States Marines because they thought the United States Marines were crazy because they were such fierce fighters. The Marines felt the same way about the Japanese soldiers. But once a Japanese soldier was captured or surrendered, they were as docile as you can imagine. And one of the reasons was because they had been told they were completely shamed and they could never go back home, they could never be with their family again. And many of them spoke about going to Brazil or South America, other places in South America. But in many respects, they were very much like the American soldiers. They had not chosen this war themselves. Politicians and other people had done that. I mentioned Higgins boats. You probably all know what a Higgins boat is. If you don't know, they were landing craft LCVPs, what they're called, landing craft vehicle personnel. It was about a 30-foot boat, about 10 feet wide. They had a drop bow so that they could pull right up onto the beach, and the soldiers could run out to the beach rather than clamber over the sides. It was quite an innovation for the United States military, although in my research I discovered that it was actually not an innovation of Mr. Higgins or the United States military. It was actually stolen intellectual property from the Japanese. In 1937, the Daihatsu company made a version of this, and U.S. Marine spies had located it, taken pictures of it, and provided pictures of it to Andrew Higgins in New Orleans, who then incorporated it into one of his boats called the Eureka boat. And of course, about 23,000 of those were made, enabling us to invade not only the islands in the Pacific, but also in the D-Day. My father told a lot of stories, and I'll tell a few of them. One of them is about a Higgins boat. One about his third invasion of a beach. So he's now a veteran here. He's done this a couple of times already. You clamber over the side of a ship and you drop down into the Higgins boat with about 35 of your buddies. It's filled with all sorts of weapons, and they ride you into the beach. He's riding into the beach again, his third time. On this one, they had loaded crates and crates of hand grenades in the middle of it. So there were probably only about 20 guys in the boat. Grenades. So as they're going in, they hit a big wave as they're circling around before they're waiting for other boats. They hit a big wave, and everything in the center of the boat shifts, all the crates. My father and his buddy hear this hissing sound. And if you've never thrown a grenade, you know there's a hissing sound of the fuse of the grenade. My father thought, oh my God, that's a grenade. That goes off, the whole boat's gone because there are 1,000 grenades there. He and his buddy went over the side. Well, it turned out it wasn't a grenade. So as he loses his rifle, he and his buddy lose their rifles. They come up, and their boat is pulling around, and has it blown up. And his buddies reach over and bring him back in. Nobody says a word. Nobody says, you idiot, what did you do? Everybody understood what had happened. It was not a fuse from a grenade. It was a flamethrower valve that was knocked loose. And a flamethrower valve, when it's knocked loose, makes the same hissing sound as a grenade fuse. So, frankly, his buddies looked at him with a certain amount of respect, thinking that you were the smart guys. we could have been dead. But anyway, he got to the beach safely and survived that. It's often said that Japs fought for the emperor, the British fought for glory, and the Americans fought for souvenirs. And there was nothing. My father tells a story. He goes to the first beach, and he comes. And of course, after you hit the beachhead, the beach gets secured. They will come back to the ship because you got to hit another beach. They don't want the Marines to secure do anything other than do the heavy fighting, then come back, then hit another beach and do the heavy fighting. So what he did, he came back, and all the Navy guys said, "Did you bring anything? Did you bring a samurai sword or a gun or something?" He said, "Well, no, I got my M1. What are you talking about?" And he realized that these sailors would never be on the beach, and the sailors wanted souvenirs. So he and his pal decided the next time they'd be prepared. So after the next beach hits the beach, they found an old parachute, and they cut it up into patches about this big. And my father, who was very good at making kanji characters, which are the Japanese characters, painted with red paint Japanese characters on these flags, so they looked like Japanese flags. And they sold them to the sailors for $10 a piece. And made a fortune. Now, so I laughed and said, well, that means there's a bunch of sailors down in their rec room somewhere. They're telling the story about how they're captured this Japanese flag. Isn't that cool? In America. And he says, yes. I said, well, out of curiosity, what did you put on there? What character? He said, well, I put the one that I could make the best. I said, what was that? It says United States Marine Corps. So somewhere there are some flags like that. One of the things that, as a Japanese interpreter, you had to do was to help fish out holdouts on these islands. When Saipan, Tinian, and Gebi, you'd have 5,000 Japanese soldiers, and there'd be 300 or 400 who would hold out in the jungle or hold out in the caves. You may have read stories that in the 1960s, even, Japanese soldiers were still wandering out in the Philippines and some other places, wandering out of the jungle, thinking the war was still on. So one of the things they did was to go to these caves, and oftentimes what would happen would be, he would have a megaphone and yell to the people in the caves, come on out, you know, the war's over for you, we got the island, we'll treat you right. Very few cases did anybody come out. Sometimes civilians would come out. Oftentimes you would hear, "Banzai, banzai!" and you'd hear an explosion. And what they would do would be committing what you know as harikiri, which is wrong, it's called harakiri, or seppuku, which means stomach cutting, which is the ceremonial killing of yourself. You take a tanto, which is a short sword, and you jab it into your stomach. Well, the Japanese discovered it's easier to just put a grenade in your belly, and that does the trick. So that would oftentimes happen. On occasion, the Japanese soldiers would capture civilians who lived on the island and hold them sort of as hostages or protection. And at least on one occasion, well, first let me tell you that the Japanese language officers, like my father, would have to teach his fellow Marines a few Japanese words. Stop, put your hands up, take your clothes off so you don't have any weapons. Things like drop your weapon, that kind of thing. So every so often they would have a little school, and they teach all the Marines a few phrases like that. So all the Marines do a few phrases like that. So once he's on Tinian, and they've got a whole bunch of people pulled up, and they think there are a lot of civilians in there. And the civilians, they of course don't want to hurt the civilians, so eventually they start coming out, and a bunch of young children start coming out, and a bunch of old ladies start coming out. And the Marines are all standing around armed and watching for anybody to be armed, and they're passing through. And at some point, the trail stops and nobody's coming out. And finally, out of the darkness, a very tall, slim, incredibly attractive young Asian woman walks out in this long, beautiful white kimono, just walking with her nose kind of in the air, walking out. And to a man, as if on cue, every United States Marine said that in Japanese, "Take their clothes off." Well, needless to say, she did not. She didn't even acknowledge it, continued to walk right past it. So there was some humor. One of the most common but unpleasant jobs of my father and his compatriots was probably one of the most important one as well. While Marines buried their own dead, or at least graves registration did, Marines covered their pals with ponchos until the graves registration people come. They would not touch any Japanese soldiers for any reason. Just walk right by. No respect for them, no burial, nothing. Occasionally they would strip them with souvenirs, which was oftentimes very dangerous because the Japanese oftentimes would booby trap souvenirs, so they would blow up. Occasionally there was the danger of what my father used to call natural explosion. Occasionally a Marine would not be too smart and would see a dead Japanese soldier who, sadly, a dead human body bloats up in the heat, and the belly becomes like a balloon, and sometimes a Marine would decide he wanted to use his bayonet, and you can imagine what happens. They would treat him the way they treat a skunked dog down in the hollow. The next week or so he would be away, but that did happen. But the interpreters had a very important job, and that was to search the pockets and packs of any soldiers for papers, orders, maps, anything that could constitute actionable intelligence about the enemy, the numbers, the weapons, the resources, the intent, the plans, expectations. You never knew what you might find. However, this job required the rather unpleasant task of going through the pockets of a dead man, maybe one you just killed, or maybe one that had been dead for quite some time, and rummaging around through stinking filth to do this. However, as my father would say, is if you got the right map, you got the right order, you got the right letter, you might save the lives of a lot of Marines. He said he never knew whether it did or not, because what they would do would be they'd do preliminary analysis of that intelligence and then send it back to headquarters for more sophisticated analysis. However, he also said one of the sad things that happened to see is even if you got military intelligence in that way, you also saw the tokens of their humanity. You saw their letters from their mother. You saw their letters to their girlfriend. You saw the pictures of their family. You saw all of the elements of their humanity. My father kept some of those things, and as a child, I used to rummage through them in some of his boxes. Almost every story you hear about war that's told by a soldier who was actually in battle, you will hear the story of his first kill. I asked my father 1,000 times, did you ever kill a man in war? His answer was always, well, you know, you never know. You're all shooting at a bunch of places, just like a firing squad. You never know who's shooting the guy. And I kind of accepted that for a long time. Until he gave me his book in 1985, and that's on page 77, where he talks about the first man he killed. In the moment, I got to tell you, my heart dropped. I mean, I knew my father was in war. I knew he was kill or be killed. But that moment when you realize your father has killed another human being was a tough moment. There are stories like that in almost every memoir of the Pacific that I've read. William Manchester, Goodbye Darkness, tells his on the first page. Tim O'Brien, Corporal Allen J, a bunch of other writers say this. I've detected that there's a story here that is common. So every time a combat soldier tells that story, there's usually a preface, kind of an apology of sorts about having to kill someone. Then there's a detailed description of the man. Oftentimes there's a comment that he was very much like me. There's a detailed description of the moment. Oftentimes it's described in slow motion. Then there's remorse. Then there's a justification. Well, it was killed, be killed. I had to do it, I had no choice. Then at the end, it's basically move on and forget it. I had to do it, I had no choice. That is, anyone who's been in combat has that story. Some get told, some don't. I'm thinking at some point someone should collect those stories because they're so poignant. There is another irony of war, which William Manchester writes about. I don't know if you know William Manchester, rather prolific historian who wrote of his own experiences in the Pacific, but wrote a bunch of other incredible books. He tells of the irony of combat, the irony of a man who is trained to use a weapon, to disassemble it and reassemble it in the dark, in the rain, at night, whatever, and to use it to kill other human beings. But the irony of a revulsion to guns, a revulsion to weapons of war. I'll read you what Manchester said. He talks about the dreams that he had. He said, the dream started after I flung my pistol into the Connecticut River. It was mine to fling. I was, I suppose, the only World War II Marine who had to buy his own weapon. My .45 was stolen and hidden by a demented corporal the day before we shoved off for Okinawa. The battalion commander regretfully told me that there was no provision for such a crisis. He promised me the rifle of the first man to fall on the beach. Somehow unreassured, I bought a Colt from a supply sergeant who would never be close enough to the front line even to hear the artillery. The transaction was illegal, of course, but I had a receipt for $35, and afterwards I kept the gun. It lay unloaded and unclean in the back of the file cabinet for 23 years, until 1968 when Bob Kennedy was killed. Then on impulse, in revulsion against all weapons, I threw it away. That, I thought, severed my last link with the war. Kilroy was, for me, no longer there. Like Corporal Manchester, Corporal Tillery developed a revulsion against all weapons. He too had a .45. I can recall seeing that in his closet without ever being touched, ever being shot, no bullets. It too went to a watery grave. That was because of Hurricane Betsy in 1965. I want to talk a little bit about post-war legacy. When my father became a grandfather for the first, or was about to become a grandfather for the first time, my mother said, well, what's your grandfather name going to be? He said, well, grandfather, of course. We said, well, you're not in the movie Heidi, you know, nobody's going to call him grandfather. So my mother decided she would be called Honey, because she didn't want to have a name like Grandma. So if she was Honey, I said, well, why don't you be Gunny? He said, well, okay, Honey, Gunny, that sounds good. And I said, well, it's a promotion. He said, sure, that's three ranks up. I was a corporal, now I'm a gunnery sergeant. So he became a grandfather and he got a promotion at the same time. Post-war, my father would often say, usually men who did not serve, and almost never any who served at the point, for the first one to say, send in the Marines. I said, my dad, let me quote him, often during the last 20 years at cocktail parties or at fancy restaurants or in comfortable homes, I hear well-dressed bon vivants say, why don't we send the Marines in and clean them up? Bomb them back to the Stone Age. I make no moral judgments. I make no political decisions. I just remember the beach at Anawita. I don't want to go back. I don't want my children to go back. I wonder if he was ever there, this sender of Marines, if he ever smelled the dead cooking and rotting in the hot sand of the nameless tropical island. I visited Hiroshima last year, Jennifer and I did. As I stood in the shadow of the atomic dome, that is the remnants of the building you may know it, the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotional Hall. It's the only building that's left in the bomb. Near the Hypo Center, or Ground Zero, on the day the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy in the city, I thought of my father, who had a small role in that drama. He and his patrols were responsible for finally securing the north field of Tinian Island, from whence that B-29 flew, allowing Seabees to construct the long runways leading to the Japanese homeland. When Tinian had been taken, there were many Japanese soldiers still there, and they had to be cleared out. He was part of patrols that for several months cleared them out. So he cleared the land, which became the runways from which the Enola Gay took off. I also thought of another connection, strange how there's connections in life. The radar operator on the Enola Gay was a man named Sergeant Joseph S. Dvorak. He was my Aunt Zena's uncle. I never knew him, but he was there. I was born 9 years after this event. My father lived to see the World War II museum built in New Orleans. We grew up in New Orleans, that's where he was. I have two brothers, we each have a son each. In 2009, we visited the museum with my father. So he had his 3 sons and his 3 grandsons with him. It was a really wonderful event. We had a great time. We asked him kids asked him a lot of questions. At the end of the museum, if you've been there, there is a big map on the wall of Japan. There's a big sign that says Operation Downfall, an operation that never occurred. And there are arrows showing the various Army, Marine, Navy units that would have attacked Japan. One of my nephews, Matt, pointed out to his gunny. He said, "Gunny, look, this is your unit right here on, what is it, Kyushu. Were you there? Were you there on that beach? Did you invade Japan?" I saw a tear come down my father's eye. And he turned away. My father was a tough Marine. He didn't cry. He held Matt close and said, "No, son, I wasn't there. If I had been there, none of you would be here." I'd like to play for you now a short video of my father. He was interviewed by the World War II Museum. While he's setting that up, I'll tell you, my father lived for 92 years, which is 33,680 days. He spent 870 of them in the Pacific in the service of the United States Marine Corps. Most of them at the point, being fired upon and firing at other men. That was less than 3% of his life. However, to almost to the day he died, he would say, not a day went by that he did not think of his experiences in that war. Not a day. He also said he had a recurring dream. And I heard this many times. His dream was of a young soldier appearing to him in the middle of the night, with lightning and thunder around him. And the young soldier approaches him and says, "Remember, old man, we survived." We'll let him speak for himself.
Oh, man.
Quicker. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, whoever.
What's your philosophy on life now, I guess, after experiencing? I'm glad you asked me that because I thought last night I wanted to say this. I left the Marine Corps, and I had to buy my life back to the Corps. I never wanted to touch one again. I never wanted to hold a weapon. I never wanted to shoot a weapon, and I never have. I said one time after the war, I never wanted to hurt anything. I never wanted to hurt anything. Now later on, I read a quote by a relatively famous person who said the same thing. After he'd been in the war, I don't want to hurt anything. I'm trying to trace that comment. I thought it was Ernie Pyle, but I'm not sure. But war was such a waste. You see, I saw Japanese differently from most Marines. I saw them killing them, and then I knew a lot of them in camp. They told me about their mothers and their grandmothers, and they were going to school, they were going to be a welder, so I got to know some of them. They didn't want this war any more than I did. So when I hear television, I'm like, going to war. God, can you imagine hitting a beach and seeing 40 dead Japanese soldiers in all manners of beaten up heads gone? That's what I remember about the war, the waste of it, an absolute total waste. Of course, in this case, it was necessary, but that's the killing, the dying, the hurting people. One time, a year or two ago, for some reason, I went to a gun show down in Jefferson Parish. I don't know if you've ever been to a gun show, but I walked in that gun show, I almost couldn't breathe. All of this material there, for one thing, to kill people. I don't mean they were going to kill people, but the purpose of it is to hurt something. God, I couldn't wait to get out of there. I never wanted to have a gun. I never wanted to shoot a gun. And that's what I remember from the war. I had enough of it.
Well, I appreciate you agreeing to be interviewed today. I think you've gone through your service and
Just leave you with a couple of comments from two Civil War generals that you might be familiar with. One is well-known, William comes to Sherman, who said war is hell. He knew that very well. He posed it upon a lot of folks. But Robert E. Lee said as well that war is so terrible, or else we should grow too fond of it. Thank you all very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Questions?
This is the interactive part.
Sir? Where's your daddy interred?
In New Orleans. In New Orleans.
Why did they put the museum there?
Because of two things. Stephen Ambrose, who wrote a lot of historical books, he was at the University of New Orleans, and he started the effort to have a D-Day museum, and he did it there because he was there, number one, but also number two, because the University of New Orleans, where he taught, is very near where the plants of Andrew Higgins were. The Higgins boats were manufactured near Lake Pontchartrain, not far from where Ambrose's office was, so there was a great confluence of events there. And it started out as the D-Day Museum and has expanded. It's now the World War II Museum, and it's started out as one little tiny building. It's now a campus. As I was telling people at dinner, it is a destination in and of itself. There are a lot of reasons, good reasons to go to New Orleans, food, drink, entertainment, etc. But you might want to go there just for that. It really is worth seeing, and allow for more than one day, because it really is a lot to take in. I recommend it. And there is a Higgins boat there, the recreation. Yes, sir.
Were the Marines issued a suicide kit?
I'm sorry?
Were the Marines issued a suicide kit?
Were the Marines issued a suicide kit?
Well, some Marines would tell you K-rations. The closest thing might be the K-bar knife that all Marines were issued. You'd have to take your own life with that, which would be a tough one. But the Japanese soldiers, as I said, many of them had the short sword, which they called tanto, which that had one purpose. That was so you didn't get captured.
Did your father ever go back to Japan?
No, sadly no. My uncle, who was a Marine and was younger, was part of the occupation force under MacArthur, and I always wanted to bring my father back, but you know, he was busy in his business and politics and lots of other things, and we never got around to doing it. So Jennifer and I went just recently.
He's very well spoken, as are you.
My father did continue to speak Japanese up until almost the day he died. In New Orleans, there were lots of, you might imagine, Japanese tourists, and he got a big kick out of sitting next to them, eating beignets and coffee with chicory, and overhearing their conversations, and then in perfect Japanese saying, "Would you pass the salt?" or something. And they go, "Oh my goodness, there's this American." And he had a teacher who was from a particular area of Tokyo, and he developed that accent. So when he beat Japanese from the Tokyo area, someone would say, you know, "How long did you live in Tokyo?" in the southwest corner or whatever, because his accent met that criteria.
And also, how old was your father when he became a Marine?
He was a Marine. He was 8. He turned 19 on the beach of Engebe. So he was 18 when he joined, and 19 and 20. So he was in for about 2.5 years.
And then did he come back to the United States and go to college?
Yes, he did come back and went to LSU, and then went to law school, and he all on the GI Bill, which he forever said was one of the greatest things in the world to be able to have that. He was discharged right before the bomb was dropped, and he went to an officer training program. They gave him an option to go in for another 6 months and become a second lieutenant, and he did it. He actually signed up, and then he had second thoughts about it. And as it turned out, it probably was good, because he would have been sent to Korea. He would have been called back to Korea had he done that, because he would have been a reserve. So he became a lawyer instead. He wanted to be a journalist, and he's a writer, so he wrote a book. But he said he went to the library at LSU right before graduation, and he looked up the average salaries of a variety of professions. And he looked at journalist versus lawyer and said, maybe I'll be a lawyer. That kind of worked out for him.
I love the stories of your dad as to how he grew up. Could you please share with the room about his drawer?
Well, my father grew up, you know, you talk about the greatest generation. We were talking at dinner, how could they have gone through this war? Well, they went through the Depression, for goodness sakes. If you went through a Depression, you can go through a war, but they went through both. My father's father was a fire captain in Shreveport, so he's a public servant, didn't make a whole lot of money, and he had 2 brothers, and they lived in a small house in Shreveport, Louisiana, and my father did not have his own room. He lived in the second one room, actually it was a porch with his brothers, and all he had was a drawer, and that's where he had to keep everything in his entire life, was in a small drawer. And he finally went to LSU and got 3 drawers. He was fascinated. He got 3 drawers. And in the Marine Corps, they gave him, you know, a duffel bag and a case. So yes, he grew up in stark poverty, selling his mother's fried pies on the side of the road and working in a filling station and doing all sorts of odd jobs. But they, you know, that was the greatest generation. They went through the Depression, for goodness sakes. And so going through the war, as awful as that was, it's almost like they were ready for it. Is there one over there? Question?
What do we, yes, sir, in the back. I'm sorry.
Did your father discourage you from going to the military?
Did your father discourage you from going into the military?
No, 2 things. One, my older brother was a sergeant major in the ROTC at a Jesuit high school, of all things, something I could never quite coordinate. There was Marine junior ROTC at this Catholic high school in New Orleans. It was a little odd juxtaposition, but my brother was a sergeant major. My father was very proud of him. I joined the band, and the marching band in New Orleans, marching bands are big. We wore Marine dress blues in our marching band. I came home in my Marine dress blues because I was going to go march in a Mardi Gras parade, and I thought my father would be so proud of me to see me in Marine dress blues. And he had the most disgusted look on his face, and I was crestfallen. I couldn't understand, and he turned away and walked away. Very unusual for my father. And I asked my mother, "What's going on?" He said, "You're not a Marine. You didn't earn that." And he felt that was just so wrong to do that. And he later explained it to me, and that's exactly the reason for it. But no, he did not discourage us. And he actually, he didn't encourage us to enlist to go to Vietnam, I'll tell you that. But on the other hand, he absolutely said, if you were drafted, if you were called by your country, you go. You owe this country everything, and you go. You don't go to Canada. My mother, on the other hand, protected her babies. There's one over here. Yes, sir.
Nuts and bolts question about the museum down there. Is it well protected from hurricanes?
Is the museum well protected from hurricanes?
That's my worry about having a museum in New Orleans.
Yes, it is, for this reason. Have you ever been to New Orleans?
No.
Okay. New Orleans, the French Quarter is about a mile square, built on the Mississippi River. It is the highest point in the entire area. That's why they built the city there in the first place. They should never have built outside the French Quarter. But the French Quarter is on a ridge and is high, and even during Hurricane Katrina, where the water was in my parents' house was 22 feet high in the suburbs, there was probably 6 inches of water in the French Quarter. Nothing at all. The museum is on the edge of the French Quarter, still on a portion of the ridge, so I don't believe that area has ever flooded in any significant way. And it's back from the river, and it's protected by a lot of big buildings, so I don't think that's a serious concern for that area.
Sir.
Have you been to the Marine Museum off Quantico?
I have not. It is on my to-do list, but I've sent them a copy of my dad's book. I've not been there. Yes.
Just wondering if your impression of their interpretation of World War II, something like.
It's on my list. When I do it, I'll let you know.
Okay, a couple of housekeeping things. One is the date. Oh, I'm sorry. Where did I see? Oh, sorry.
Did your father ever have any contact with any of the Japanese that were interned?
Did your father have any contact with the Japanese that were interned?
They were, they were Americans. They spoke. I will tell you one story that I didn't say, which was a fascinating one. At some point, my father. Usually there was only one interpreter with the unit because there were so few interpreters. At some point, one of the guys he went to school with was joining his unit, and one night, 10 o'clock at night, a pitch black truck pulls up, and a colonel or something comes out and says, "Guys, come with us now." And you know who these people were? He just said, full bird colonel or something. You say yes sir, and you go. And it's pitch black in the middle of the night, no lights. And they take him, they drive him to what turned out to be Curtis LeMay's headquarters. Curtis LeMay was the Army Air Corps general who was responsible for all of the firebombing of Japan. They went into this giant tent, about as big as this room, and it was filled with nothing but aerial photographs blown up as big as this, hundreds and hundreds of them on easels all around the room. And they were all pictures of bombed out locations. And as it turned out, there were bombed out locations in Tokyo, Honshu, and a whole bunch of other Japanese cities. They were identified. And my dad and his buddy said, "What are we doing here?" He said, "You'll see." So they pull up another bus, and the bus is filled with Japanese officers. And there was at least one admiral, lots of captains, really high-ranking Japanese soldiers that they captured. These are the kind of guys my father would never have interrogated, the high-level guys like that. And they come in. So the colonel tells them, "Look, I want you to follow these guys around the room, show them the pictures, and I want you to translate for them if they have questions." And so they walk them around the room, and these admirals and generals and captains and colonels, Japanese army, are looking around, and they're all just slack-jawed. They cannot believe what they're looking at because they're looking at aerial photographs of cities that they lived in, worked in, and were trained in, and they were running around saying, "Oh my goodness, they're the barracks. I got a haircut there 3 weeks ago," or "Oh my God, that's where my mother's house was." And they're just astonished that number one, there could be photographs like that, number two, that the Americans had gotten that far to the homeland. And the idea was to explain this to them, that this had been done and it's going to get worse. And they were hoping that some of these Japanese soldiers, and the high-ranking ones in particular, would be able to communicate through us, obviously, back to the homeland to tell them, "Stop fighting." That didn't work out. That didn't work out, obviously, but that was the theory. And apparently, as quickly as it happened, they whoever those guys were, they put them on a bus and took them away and never saw it again. But it was a reasonable attempt by them, yes.
So did your father ever speak to you about transitioning back into civilian life? Yeah, obviously he was fairly well adjusted being able to go to school and everything, but did he speak to you about the challenges, any hardships?
I asked about them, yes, excellent question. I asked about them, but he, within 3 weeks of his discharge, he was back on Greenwood Road, as he said, working in the filling station that he had worked in before he left, like nothing had ever happened. And you gotta remember the home front there had been no battles there, even though there was limitations and rationing and things like that. And he also said it would have been considerably different without the GI Bill. The GI Bill allowed him, paid for everything, food, transportation, tuition, room and board, everything, for the remainder of his college as well as for law school. And he wasn't alone, it was a gift. And he said without that, transition would have been a lot more difficult. Yes?
I don't know if you knew, McCaskey High School in Lancaster, right at the Pearl Harbor, all the women were on the playground out there, and they were given rifles. They were given rifles to defend themselves in case. Yes, at McCaskey.
Everyone heard that McCaskey.
My sister was one of them.
Were they taught to use them?
Yeah, I mean, how did he use them, and they were with self-defense. They learned all the ways of self-defense. This was quite a while, and they did.
Good thing the Japanese didn't invade
years.
Lancaster. Bunch of McCaskey girls with guns? That's trouble.
And now they're women.
Really? Wow, that's amazing.
Yes. And my sister was one of them.
Oh, good.
Last question over here.
The letters that came off of the Japanese soldiers, were you ever thought about returning them to?
You know, that's actually a very interesting question. The question is the letters from the Japanese soldiers, everything about returning them to. Sadly, I didn't until they were gone, until I was older and started studying history and wanted to be able to do something like that. I have, in fact, the Arisaka rifle that my father took from Tinian in 1944. I know where it was made, I know the serial number, I have all that information. Tracking it, I've tried to track down who it was issued to originally. I know that it was issued in 1939 to a soldier in the Sino-Japanese War in Manchuria and fought with 507th or something. So I know some information. If I could find out whose family that is, I would go back to it. There are lots of stories of men doing that and reconnecting. There are some, in some of the books about the Japanese interpreters, some of my father's pals, one or two of them were able to connect with some of the soldiers that they had interviewed in POW camps and gone back to Japan and met them. So it would be an amazing event.
One more thing.
Sure.
When it comes to the rifle, I mean not the rifle, but the big swords
Right.
that they have,
Samurai swords.
that belongs to the families.
Yes.
And a lot of people, when they found this out, they returned it many years later for the family.
Yes, that's true.
Not criminal.
The Arisaka rifles, all weapons did not belong to the military in Japan. They did not belong to the soldiers. You know who they belonged to? The emperor. They were all belonging to the emperor. You know how you know? Because the chrysanthemum, which is the symbol of the empire, the emperor, is stamped on the register of every one of those rifles. Many rifles today that you find on eBay and places do not have that because in a last gasp of pride, I suppose, the Japanese army, despite the fact that it had been defeated and surrendered, ordered that every one of those rifles grind off the chrysanthemum before they were turned into the U.S. military because they felt it was insulting to turn over something that was identified as belonging to the emperor to the United States. So finding one with a chrysanthemum is rare.
Okay, couple of housekeeping things, don't go away. May 23rd is our next date. Put that in your date calendar, put it in your phone, look for some email. Number two, I love the idea of putting your phone number on the sign-up sheet there, because we can start a text, which is a lot easier than email. Number three, don't forget, this is all done by donations. The containers over there, we welcome anything that you could do. You can contribute. Lastly, share your experiences, anything that you have or anybody that you know that might be a speaker. I want to say thank you to you for being here. And the last thing I want to do is I want to get a picture with you and Bev. And we have there's no event in my life that you don't get a certificate of appreciation. You know, and we appreciate you being here. We thank you. Lots of good things that we've learned from this, and we hope that you will come back and visit with us and be a part of this as we continue to grow. So with that said, we're going to do a picture here, and just if everybody can just stay still for just a second, just so we get Bev in here.
And a round of applause right now.
And